Good afternoon and welcome to the Migration Policy Institute and the release of our new report, Understanding the Potential Impact of Executive Action on Immigration Enforcement. My name is Doris Meissner. I'm a senior fellow and I direct our U.S. Immigration Policy Program here. I'm pleased to introduce my colleague Mark Rosenblum, who's the author of the report and the Deputy Director of MPI's U.S. Immigration Policy Program, along with our guests, who will comment on various aspects of the report. They are Mary Giovangianoli, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Immigration Policy at the Department of Homeland Security, and Julie Myers-Wood, former Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and now the CEO of Guidepost Solutions. The bios are on your chairs, so we won't go any further into credentials here. Today's event is also being live streamed, so welcome also to our online viewers. After the speaker presentations, we'll have audience Q&A, as is typical for us, but those who are not in the room can tweet questions to @migrationpolicy or using hashtag MPIExecAct, that's MPIExecact. So feel free to send your questions at any time. We'll place them in a queue and get to them when we're in the Q&A period. So then let me turn to our program. Today's report and the data analyses that you see in it stem from the executive action that was announced in November of last year, 2014, by President Obama. That executive action is best known for its focus on two deferred action programs, the expansion of a program known as DACA and the announcement of a new program known as DAPA. However, it was a wide-ranging announcement, and it introduced and included two significant enforcement provisions. One was changes in the guidelines for exercising prosecutorial discretion, and the second was the introduction of a new program, PEP, the Priority Enforcement Program, to replace the Secure Communities Program. These provisions have been of particular interest to MPI because of a long line of research that we've done on immigration enforcement. That research is all available at our website, www.migrationpolicy.org, along with this newest entry to that body of work, which Mark will now outline for you. Mark?
Thanks, Doris. Thank you for being here, and thanks to Mary and So as Doris said, this report really builds on a series of work that MPI has done over the last 3 years on the U.S. immigration enforcement system. And I'll speak for just a few minutes to review some of those earlier findings, because I think they're important for sort of setting the stage for the executive announcements of 2014 and for this current research. And then I'll get into the main body of this report, looking at the 2014 enforcement priorities and the replacement of secure communities with the Priority Enforcement Program, PEP. So one of the most important pieces of background is that the United States has invested heavily in immigration enforcement over the last 2 decades, and especially since the 9/11 attacks. This figure shows the growth in immigration enforcement spending in constant dollars. Since 1996, U.S. spending on immigration enforcement has increased almost 5-fold, controlling for inflation from just under $4 billion to over $18 billion. So the U.S. spends more on immigration enforcement than on all other federal criminal law enforcement agencies combined. The other thing you can see in this picture, the line in this picture, is removals, and you can see that removals have increased, almost in lockstep with enforcement spending. The 1996 Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, IRA, was a major turning point in immigration enforcement, and it shifted the U.S. from a system that relied almost exclusively on informal returns to a system that relies increasingly, now exhaustively, on formal removals. So informal returns are a form of deportation that carry no additional penalty beyond being deported. Formal removals make the person who's deported ineligible to return to the United States and subject to criminal prosecution if they do re-enter. And what you can see here is that historically, fewer than 5% of deportations were formal removals. Now it's over 70%. To a large extent, this shift has been accomplished by allowing DHS to execute most removals on its own instead of requiring an immigrant to go before an immigration judge, to appear before an immigration judge. Prior to 1996, almost all removals involved an appearance before an immigration judge. Now more than 4 out of 5 are non-judicial. So, and then the more recent trend that I want to focus on, just really in the last decade, has been an increased focus on interior enforcement. This figure, the blue bars in this figure are apprehensions that occur at the border. The red bars are apprehensions that occur in the interior, or it's CBP versus ICE. And what you can see is that historically, over 90% of apprehensions occurred at the border. Beginning in 2006, the share of apprehensions occurring in the interior increased, and that results from a policy change that occurred after the comprehensive immigration reform negotiations in Congress broke down in 2006. There was an explicit effort to increase interior enforcement, partly to put pressure on congressional Republicans to get more serious about passing immigration reform. So the Obama administration inherited new programs and new technology to reach more effectively into immigrant communities to do interior enforcement, and continued those programs. So you can see in the figure that if those interior apprehensions continued to increase during the first years of the Obama administration, remained at historically high levels. So by 2011, with border apprehensions falling due to reduced unauthorized immigration and interior apprehensions, at these very high levels, we see basically that half of all apprehensions in 2011 occurred within the U.S. So that's totally unthinkable a few years ago. But there's a reason that most immigration enforcement historically has occurred at the border. And it's partly because interior enforcement has a much larger impact on not just settled immigrant communities, legal and unauthorized, but has a bigger footprint in general. It's a costlier way to do immigration enforcement. And so the rise in interior removals that accompanied this more aggressive interior enforcement began to provoke, some backlash. And in 2010 and 2011, the Obama administration published a pair of policy guidance memos designed to focus interior enforcement more narrowly on high priority cases. The specific content of these memos wasn't particularly controversial, or shouldn't have been controversial, because the priorities that were identified are long-standing enforcement priorities. People who've been convicted of crimes, people apprehended at the border. But the memos were controversial because they very explicitly and formally identified these priorities and put them all in one place to describe who would be prioritized for enforcement and who should be in line potentially for a favorable exercise of prosecutorial discretion. And those memos had a big impact on what immigration enforcement looks like in the U.S. So what this figure shows is border enforcement. The combined shape here is the total number of people apprehended and removed from the border, and then the colors describe who they are, how many were non-criminals, how many were had been convicted of immigration crimes versus other crimes. And what you can see in this picture is that the publication of these memos in 2010 and 2011 did not have a dramatic impact on border enforcement. Border removals increased a little bit after those memos, but there's not a dramatic change. But it did have a dramatic impact on interior enforcement. So prior to what you can see in this figure describes growing interior removals generally between 2003 up through 2011. There's growth in the total number of interior removals. But what you can see is that between 2003 and about 2009, most of that growth consisted of people who had never been convicted of crimes, non-criminals. That the blue band is the part that's getting bigger in the figure. With the publication of the memos in 2010 and 2011, this figure changes, and you see first that the growth in total removals begins to level off. but a much larger share of interior removals consists of people who've been convicted of crimes. And over the course between 2010 and 2013, the number of non-criminals deported from within the U.S. has fallen pretty dramatically. And you can also see that most of the people who have been convicted of crimes and deported from within the U.S. have not just been convicted of immigration crimes, but other crimes. That the green band in this picture really represents most of the interior removals that have occurred since 2010. So that brings us up to the 2014 executive actions. The president announced a number of different executive actions in November. As Doris mentioned, the expansion of the Deferred Action for childhood arrivals and the creation of the new Deferred Action for parents of Americans and lawful permanent residents attracted the most attention. He also announced expansions of opportunities for high-skilled immigrants and programs to promote naturalization and integration. This report focuses just on the changes to DHS enforcement practices that were announced, and in particular, new policy guidance on DHS enforcement priorities that update the 2010 and 2011 memos that I referred to, and that I'll say more about in a moment, and replacement of the Secure Communities Program with the new Priority Enforcement Program. He also announced changes to the border enforcement that we don't address in this report. So let me focus on the new DHS enforcement priorities. And the reason that these priorities are so important is that in our earlier work looking at ICE administrative data, what we found is that the publication of the 2010 and 2011 policy guidance, the DHS has over time adhered very strictly to those policy priorities, and 99% of all removals in 2013 were consistent with the formal priorities that the department has announced. So, that suggests that these priorities are important to look at because DHS is likely to adhere to them. So how do they differ? What changed between 2010, 2011, and 2014? Well, the 2010 priorities, which were republished in 2011, define the first priority for enforcement as national security and public safety threats, including gang members and immigrants who have previously been convicted of any crime. The second priority was recent border crossers and other illegal entrants. And the third priority were non-citizens who obstruct immigration controls by failing to leave the country after an order of removal or by re-entering after an order of removal. Those priorities have been redefined, and now what they say is that the first priority consists of national security threats and gang members as before. It also includes people apprehended immediately at the border, and people who have been, and instead of any previous criminal conviction, it's people who have been convicted of felonies or aggravated felonies. The second category is people who have been convicted of more minor crimes, 3 or more misdemeanors, or 1 serious misdemeanor, which the priorities define more specifically than that, and people who have enter or re-enter unlawfully since January 1st, 2014. And the third priority are non-citizens subject to a final order of removal after January 1st, 2014. So the differences between them, one difference is that border crossers have now been named a top priority instead of a second priority. The new priorities make a clear distinction between people who entered or were ordered removed before January of 2014 versus people who enter or were ordered removed more recently. Previously, the timing on the priorities was a sort of a moving window of the last 3 years, and now it's a set date. So it's a bright line between before and after January 2014. The new priorities focus only on serious criminals instead of anybody who's ever been convicted of including a minor conviction. And the other difference is that the new memo gives direction to enforcement officials on how to balance these enforcement priorities against factors that would make somebody potentially eligible for the favorable exercise of prosecutorial discretion. So ICE previously published a list of reasons that someone was a priority for enforcement and a list of reasons that somebody could benefit from the favorable exercise of discretion, but not what to do when somebody falls onto both lists. And the new memo gives some direction for how to weigh those competing concerns. So then we project, well, what is this going to mean, and how do these priorities apply to the existing unauthorized population? And our bottom line is that we estimate that about 87% of the